March 17, 1943. The North Atlantic, approximately 400 miles southeast of Iceland. A 19-year-old mess attendant named Doris Miller stood in the galley of the USS Bory, peeling his 200th potato of the morning shift, watching the cold grey water through a porthole as the destroyer escort rolled through 12-foot swells. He had no idea that within 6 hours, the contents of the sack beside him would become the most unlikely weapon in naval history. He believed, as did everyone aboard, that potatoes were simply food, that mess attendants were simply cooks, and that a young black sailor from Louisiana would never have the chance to prove himself in combat, the way white sailors could. He was wrong about all three assumptions in ways that would transform not just his own life, but the lives of every man aboard that ship, and ultimately influence the desegregation of the United States military itself. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What began as another routine convoy escort duty would become a desperate struggle for survival, a testament to human ingenuity under impossible pressure and proof that heroism recognizes no color, only courage. The events of that day would be documented in official Navy records, investigated by skeptical superior officers, and eventually become one of the most extraordinary accounts of the Battle of the Atlantic, a story so improbable that it remained classified for nearly 2 decades because no one in the Pentagon believed vegetables could defeat steel. Doris Miller was not supposed to be there. Born in Wichita, Louisiana on October 12, 1919, he had grown up in a farming community where opportunities for young black men were limited to picking cotton, working lumber mills, or following in his father's footsteps as a sharecropper. The Navy had seemed like an escape, a chance to see the world beyond the segregated South, to earn steady pay, and perhaps to gain some respect in a nation that seemed determined to deny it to people who looked like him. He had enlisted on September 16, 1939, just 2 weeks after Germany invaded Poland, though the United States would not enter the conflict for another 2 years. The recruiting officer in New Orleans had been blunt. Black sailors, he explained, were restricted to the steward's branch. They could cook, clean, serve officers their meals, and maintain living quarters, but they could not fire guns, operate machinery, or hold any position that involved actual combat. It was Navy policy, established decades earlier, reinforced by tradition, and supported by the prevailing belief among white military leadership that black men lacked the intelligence, discipline, and courage required for warfare. Doris had signed the papers anyway. Even a limited role in the Navy seemed better than a lifetime in the cotton fields. He had reported to Naval Station Great Lakes in Illinois for basic training, where he and the other black recruits were housed in separate barracks, ate in separate mess halls, and trained separately from white sailors. The instructors were white, and most made no secret of their belief that they were wasting time teaching navigation and seamanship to men who would only ever carry trays and mop floors. But Doris paid attention anyway. He memorized the parts of a ship, learned the nautical terminology, studied the basics of naval warfare, even though he knew he would never be allowed to practice it. Something in him refused to accept that his skin color determined his capabilities. After basic training, he had been assigned to the USS West Virginia as a mess attendant 3rd class. The posting was considered prestigious within the limited world available to black sailors. The West Virginia was a Colorado-class battleship, one of 16 battleships in the United States fleet, a massive steel fortress displacing 32,600 tons and carrying a crew of over 1,400 men. Doris served breakfast to officers, cleaned their staterooms, pressed their uniforms, and tried to find dignity in work that white sailors openly mocked as women's work. He had been aboard the West Virginia on December 7, 1941, moored at Pearl Harbor when Japanese aircraft appeared in the morning sky. He had been collecting laundry from officers' quarters when the first torpedo struck the ship's port side, the explosion throwing him against a bulkhead. In the chaos that followed, as the West Virginia listed heavily to port and oil fires spread across the water, Doris had done something that Navy regulations explicitly forbid. He had manned a .50 caliber anti-aircraft gun. The gunner had been struck down, lying motionless beside the weapon. Doris had no training on the gun, had never been allowed near one during his 2 years in the Navy, but he understood the basic principle from watching gunnery drills: load, aim, fire. He had dragged the fallen sailor aside, grasped the weapon's handles, and begun firing at the low-flying aircraft. He fired until the ammunition was exhausted, then moved to another gun and another, continuing until officers ordered all hands to abandon ship as the battleship settled into the harbor mud. For his actions that day, Doris Miller had become the first black American to receive the Navy Cross, presented by Admiral Chester Nimitz himself. The citation praised his distinguished devotion to duty, extraordinary courage, and disregard for his own personal safety. But it did not change Navy policy. After the ceremony, after the photographs and the brief moment of national attention, Doris had returned to his duties as a mess attendant. The Navy was grateful for his heroism, but unwilling to challenge segregation. He was promoted to mess attendant first class and transferred to the USS Indianapolis, then later to the USS Borii, where on this cold March morning in 1943, he stood peeling potatoes while dreaming of another chance to prove that he belonged in the fight. The USS Borii was a Gleaves-class destroyer, 2,100 tons displacement, 348 feet long, commissioned in January 1941. She carried a crew of 208 men, armed with 4 5-inch guns, multiple anti-aircraft weapons, depth charges and torpedo tubes. Her mission was convoy escort, protecting merchant ships making the dangerous Atlantic crossing from North America to Britain, hunting enemy submarines that prowled the shipping lanes in wolf packs, trying to starve Britain into surrender by cutting off supplies. The convoy she currently escorted consisted of 43 merchant ships arranged in 9 columns, carrying 73,000 tons of cargo: wheat from Canada, steel from Pennsylvania, aircraft parts from Michigan, ammunition from dozens of factories across the United States. The ships steamed in formation at 9 knots, the speed of the slowest vessel, zigzagging every 12 minutes to make themselves harder targets for enemy submarines. The Borii and 3 other destroyer escorts prowled the convoy's perimeter, their sonar operators listening constantly for the distinctive sound of submarine engines, their lookouts scanning for periscope wakes. Lieutenant Commander Charles Hutchins commanded the Borii. A 32-year-old graduate of the Naval Academy, he had never encountered an enemy submarine in his 18 months commanding the destroyer, though he had investigated dozens of sonar contacts that turned out to be schools of fish, whale sounds, or thermal layers in the water that created false echoes. The North Atlantic in winter was a miserable posting, with 30-foot waves, freezing rain, and the constant tension of knowing that enemy submarines could be anywhere, invisible beneath the surface, stalking the convoy like wolves circling a flock of sheep. In the galley, Doris worked alongside 3 other mess attendants, preparing the midday meal for the crew. Marcus Washington, 23, from South Carolina; James Parker, 21, from Georgia; Robert Johnson, 24, from Alabama. They represented the entire black complement of the Borii's crew, 4 men among 208, relegated to the lowest ranks, performing work that no white sailor wanted. They rarely spoke about it. What was there to say? The Navy was no different from civilian life, and at least here they earned regular pay, received 3 meals daily, and occasionally docked in ports where a man could walk into a bar without worrying whether his skin color would start a fight. The potatoes they were peeling came from a storage bin in the hold, part of 3 tons of potatoes loaded aboard in New York. Navy logistics officers calculated that a destroyer at sea required approximately 15 pounds of potatoes per day per 100 men, which meant the Borii consumed roughly 30 pounds daily. The potatoes were purchased from farms in Idaho and Maine, shipped to East Coast ports, loaded aboard supply ships, transferred to destroyers during refueling operations. Each potato represented a tiny piece of America's industrial capacity, the vast agricultural and logistical network that kept ships at sea, armies in the field, aircraft in the sky. Doris had peeled enough potatoes in 3 years of Navy service to fill a swimming pool. He estimated he had processed approximately 50,000 individual potatoes, spending roughly 1,000 hours of his life performing this single repetitive task. He could peel a potato in 45 seconds, removing the skin in a continuous spiral, checking for bad spots, cutting away eyes, dropping the finished product into a pot of cold water. His hands moved automatically, while his mind wandered, thinking about home, about his family, about the girl he had met in New York during the Bore's last Liberty call, about whether the Navy would ever allow him to do something more meaningful than prepare food for men who barely acknowledged his existence. At 1400 hours, the routine shattered. The sonar operator in the Bore's sound room detected a contact at 2,000 yards, bearing 320 degrees. The signature was clear, unmistakable. Submarine propellers, diesel-electric engines moving at approximately 8 knots. The operator called the contact to the bridge, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surge. This was real. After 18 months of false alarms, they finally had a genuine enemy contact. Commander Hutchins reached the bridge in seconds, moving from his sea cabin without bothering to grab his coat. The temperature on the bridge was barely above freezing, wind howling through the open areas where lookouts maintained their watch. But he did not notice. His attention focused entirely on the plot table, where his executive officer, Lieutenant James Ross, was marking the contact's position. "Attack procedures," Hutchins ordered. "All hands to battle stations." The alarm bells rang throughout the ship, a harsh, clanging sound that sent men running to their assigned positions. Gun crews raced to their weapons. Damage control parties checked their equipment. Engine room personnel prepared for high-speed maneuvering. Depth charge crews readied their weapons, 300-pound cylinders packed with high explosives designed to detonate at specific depths, crushing submarine hulls with hydrostatic shock. In the galley, Doris and his fellow mess attendants heard the alarm and looked at each other with familiar frustration. Battle stations meant they were supposed to report to their damage control positions below deck, waiting in the compartments where they lived and worked, ready to patch holes, fight fires, control flooding if the ship was struck. But it also meant staying out of the way, remaining invisible while white sailors fought the battle. Doris secured the galley equipment, shutting down the stoves, covering the pots, putting away anything that could become a projectile if the ship maneuvered violently. Then he headed below, following the other mess attendants down the ladder to their assigned compartment, a small space near the aft magazine where they would wait, listening to the sounds of combat filtering through the steel hull, wondering what was happening above their heads, feeling useless while other men fought. On the bridge, Hutchins studied the tactical situation. The submarine contact was ahead of the convoy, probably positioning for an approach on the merchant ships. Standard procedure called for the destroyer to race toward the contact at maximum speed, forcing the submarine to dive deep to avoid being run down, then attack with depth charges set to explode at varying depths, hoping to bracket the target and crush it with the shock waves. Hutchins ordered the Bore to 25 knots and the destroyer surged forward, her bow cutting through the swells, spray sheeting back across the deck. The range closed rapidly, 1,800 yards, 1,500, 1,200. The sonar operator maintained contact, calling updates every 30 seconds. The submarine was diving, trying to go deep, but the Bore was faster. At 800 yards, Hutchins ordered the first depth charge pattern released. 6 charges rolled off the stern racks and were thrown from the side projectors, splashing into the destroyer's wake, sinking rapidly. They were set to explode at depths ranging from 100 to 300 feet, creating a diamond pattern designed to bracket the submarine wherever it might be diving. The charges detonated in sequence, massive underwater explosions that sent columns of white water erupting above the surface. The shock waves traveled through the water at 5,000 feet per second, a hammer blow that could crack pressure hulls, jam control surfaces, shatter gauges, terrorize crews. The Bore shuddered as the shock waves reflected back against her own hull. The sonar operator lost contact in the turbulence created by the explosions. Standard procedure. It would take several minutes for the water to settle enough for sonar to be effective again. Hutchins ordered the Bore into a wide circle, maintaining speed, waiting for the sonar to regain contact. Below deck, Doris felt the depth charge explosions as dull thuds transmitted through the hull, followed by the destroyer's violent shuddering. He had experienced depth charge attacks before during training exercises, but this was different. This was real. Somewhere beneath them, enemy sailors were fighting for survival, just as he and his shipmates would be fighting if the situation was reversed. War was strange that way. Men who had never met, who had no personal quarrel with each other, trying to achieve each other's destruction simply because their governments had declared them enemies. 5 minutes passed. The sonar operator regained contact. The submarine was still there, deeper now, approximately 400 feet, moving erratically. Hutchins ordered another attack run. The Bory accelerated again, racing toward the contact coordinates. This time the depth charges were set deeper, ranging from 300 to 500 feet. The pattern was released, the explosions followed, and again the Bory lost sonar contact in the turbulence. The submarine commander was experienced. Each time the Bory attacked, he maneuvered away from the predicted position, using every trick in the submariner's handbook to evade the depth charges. Change depth, change course, slow down to reduce noise signature, use thermal layers in the water to hide from sonar, launch decoys that created false echoes. The ocean was vast and submarines were small, and finding one was like trying to locate a single fish in a swimming pool while blindfolded, and the fish could hear you coming. The battle continued for 3 hours. The Bory made 7 attack runs, expending 42 depth charges, but each time the submarine escaped serious harm. Commander Hutchins grew increasingly frustrated. He was following doctrine perfectly, making textbook attacks, but the enemy submarine commander was better than the theoretical opponents described in the training manuals. Real combat was proving more difficult than the academy instructors had suggested. By 1700 hours, the light was beginning to fade. Sunset in the North Atlantic in mid-March came around 1830, and Hutchins knew that if they did not defeat the submarine before dark, it would escape. Submarines operated on the surface at night, where they were faster, harder to detect, and could recharge their batteries. If this submarine reached nightfall, it would surface outside sonar range and disappear. Hutchins made a decision that would have profound consequences, though he could not have known it at the time. He ordered the Bory to make one more attack run, but this time he would not rely solely on depth charges. If they could force the submarine to the surface, they could engage it with gunfire, finish it quickly rather than playing this underwater game of cat and mouse. He ordered the depth charge crews to set their weapons extremely shallow, ranging from 50 to 150 feet. The pattern would create a massive shock wave near the surface, hopefully damaging the submarine enough to force it up. It was risky. If the charges detonated too close to the Bory, they could damage the destroyer as well. But Hutchins was willing to take that risk. The Bory accelerated to maximum speed, 35 knots, racing toward the submarine's position. The depth charge crews stood ready. At the precise moment, Hutchins gave the order, and 12 depth charges were released simultaneously, the most concentrated pattern yet. The explosions merged into one continuous roar. Water erupted in a massive plume nearly 100 feet high. The shockwave was so powerful that it knocked several sailors off their feet. The Bory's stern lifted out of the water, her propellers racing as they momentarily lost contact with the sea, then slamming back down with a jarring impact that cracked deck plates. The sonar operator shouted a report. Contact breaking surface, bearing 275 degrees, range 300 yards. Hutchins ran to the port wing of the bridge, raising his binoculars. There, barely visible in the fading light, he saw the submarine. It was wallowing on the surface, obviously damaged. Water streaming from its deck as it struggled to maintain trim. A Type 7C, one of the most common submarines in the German fleet during the conflict. 167 feet long, displacing 769 tons when surfaced, armed with 5 torpedo tubes and 1 deck gun. The submarine's conning tower hatch opened, and sailors began emerging, racing toward the deck gun. They were going to fight. Hutchins ordered the Bory's 5-inch guns to open fire. The forward gun crew, trained to a high level of proficiency through endless drills, responded within seconds. The first round screamed across the water and exploded 50 feet beyond the submarine, a ranging shot. The gun captain adjusted his aim, and the second round struck the submarine's deck near the conning tower, the explosion sending a geyser of water and shrapnel into the air. The submarine's deck gun crew scattered, several men falling, but others replaced them, determined to fight back. The submarine's gun fired, a 4-inch weapon that could damage a destroyer if it landed hits on vital areas. The shell passed over the Bory's bridge with a sound like ripping canvas, close enough that Hutchins instinctively ducked. The engagement became a close-range gunfight, two vessels circling each other at ranges under 500 yards, both firing as fast as their crews could load and aim. The Bory had superior firepower, 4 5-inch guns against 1 4-inch weapon, but the submarine was a smaller target, harder to hit in the growing darkness. The Bory's guns were manned by experienced crews who had drilled for this moment throughout their service. Loader, rammer, gun captain, trainer, pointer, each man performing his specific role in the coordinated dance that transformed shells and powder charges into outgoing fire. The forward gun was firing once every 6 seconds, an impressive rate for a 5-inch weapon. But the sea was rough. Both vessels were maneuvering violently, and scoring hits was more difficult than peacetime gunnery practice against towed targets. After 5 minutes of exchange, both vessels had sustained damage, but neither had been decisively hurt. The Bory had taken 2 hits, one striking the forward deckhouse, the other passing completely through the aft funnel without exploding. The submarine had been hit at least 6 times but remained functional, its diesel engines still operating, its guns still firing. Then the situation changed in an instant. A large wave lifted the submarine's bow, and as it came down, the vessel's forward momentum drove it directly toward the Bory. Hutchins ordered hard left rudder, trying to avoid collision, but the destroyer was too close, moving too fast. The vessels came together with a grinding crash, the submarine's bow riding up onto the Bory's forward deck, the two ships interlocking in a deadly embrace. The impact threw men to the deck on both vessels. On the Bory's bridge, Hutchins grabbed a handhold to keep from falling, staring in disbelief at the sight before him. The submarine's bow was resting on his ship's deck, the two vessels locked together, hulls grinding against each other as waves pushed them in different directions. The submarine's conning tower was less than 50 feet from the Bory's bridge. He could see enemy sailors emerging from the conning tower hatch, some carrying weapons, preparing to repel boarders or perhaps attempting to board the destroyer themselves. On the submarine, Lieutenant Hans Kruger stood in the conning tower, surveying the disaster that his command had become. His boat, designated U-405, had been on patrol for 26 days, had successfully evaded 7 previous encounters with convoy escorts, and had been preparing to make an approach on the convoy when the American destroyer detected them. The subsequent depth charge attacks had caused severe damage. Battery compartment flooding, hydraulic system failure, cracked pressure hull in the forward torpedo room, multiple equipment failures throughout the boat. He had been trying to escape when that last pattern of depth charges, set impossibly shallow, had caught them at periscope depth and smashed the boat upward like a cork. Now his submarine was locked against an enemy destroyer, unable to dive, unable to maneuver away, his deck gun crew decimated by accurate fire from the destroyer's superior weapons. His options had been reduced to 2: surrender or fight to the death. German military culture provided clear guidance on that choice. Surrender was acceptable only after all means of resistance had been exhausted. His submarine still had torpedoes, though the damaged hydraulics made them difficult to launch. His crew still had small arms, and the collision had brought the vessels close enough that small arms fire might actually be effective. Kruger ordered his crew to bring up the small arms stored in the submarine's weapon lockers: rifles, submachine guns, pistols. If they were going to be destroyed, they would at least take some of the enemy with them. On the Bory, Commander Hutchins faced the same tactical calculation from the opposite perspective. His 5-inch guns could not depress enough to hit the submarine now that it was locked against his hull. His ship was taking on water from the collision damage, and the submarine's hull scraping against the Bory's plates was causing additional structural stress. He needed to separate the vessels, either by backing away or by eliminating the submarine as a threat so thoroughly that it would sink. He grabbed the ship's intercom, calling down to the damage control parties. "I need every man who can handle a weapon up on deck," he ordered. "Rifles, pistols, whatever we have. And bring grenades. We're going to clear that submarine." Below deck in his damage control station, Doris heard the order through the intercom system. His pulse quickened. This was different from Pearl Harbor, where he had acted on instinct in the chaos. This was an explicit order. Every man who can handle a weapon. Did that include mess attendants? Were black sailors included in every man, or would someone stop them if they tried to go topside? Marcus Washington looked at Doris, then at the other 2 mess attendants. "What do you think?" Washington asked. Doris stood up. The commander said, "Every man," he replied. "We're men. We're going." They climbed the ladder to the main deck, emerging into chaos. Darkness had fallen, but the scene was illuminated by the Boreas' searchlights, turned on the submarine's conning tower. The two vessels were grinding against each other, the sound of metal on metal creating a horrible screeching noise. Sailors were running along the Boreas' deck, taking cover behind equipment, firing rifles and pistols at the submarine crew who were returning fire from the conning tower and deck. A chief petty officer was distributing weapons from the ship's armory, handing out rifles to sailors as they arrived. He hesitated when he saw Doris and the other mess attendants, his ingrained prejudice warring with the explicit orders he had received. Then he shrugged and thrust rifles into their hands. "You know how to use these?" he asked. Doris took the rifle, a Springfield bolt action, checking it with practiced movements that surprised the chief. "We know," he said quietly. They moved to the port rail, taking positions between other sailors, looking down at the submarine locked against the Boreas' hull. The submarine's deck was perhaps 15 feet below them, close enough that they could see individual enemy sailors clearly in the searchlight glare. The submarine crew was firing up at the destroyer, bullets ricocheting off steel plating, occasionally finding flesh. 2 Boreas sailors were already down, one clutching his shoulder, the other motionless. Doris raised his rifle, sighted on a submarine sailor who was aiming at the Boreas bridge, and fired. The recoil was familiar from basic training, the only part of Navy training where black sailors had been allowed to handle weapons. The target fell back into the submarine's conning tower. Doris worked the bolt, chambering another round looking for the next target. Beside him, Washington, Parker, and Johnson were firing as well, their shots deliberate, aimed, effective. The close-range firefight continued for several minutes, an almost surreal engagement where sailors could see each other's faces, where every shot was personal rather than abstract. The Boreas crew had superior numbers and position, firing down into the submarine from protected positions, while the submarine crew was increasingly exposed. But the submarine sailors fought with desperate courage, knowing that capture meant years in prison camps, knowing that their boat was dying beneath them, choosing to go down fighting. Then someone on the Boreas deck threw a grenade. It arced through the air, tumbling end over end in the searchlight beams, landing on the submarine's deck near the conning tower. The explosion was bright and sharp, and when the smoke cleared, 3 submarine sailors were down. The Boreas crew saw the effectiveness of the grenade and began throwing more. Explosions rippled across the submarine's deck. The return fire slackened as submarine crew members sought cover inside the conning tower. On the submarine, Lieutenant Kruger realized his position was untenable. More than half his crew was already lost, either from the depth charge damage, the collision, or the close-range battle. His boat was taking on water faster than the pumps could handle. The diesel engines were failing. The battery compartment was flooding, releasing chlorine gas as seawater reacted with battery acid. His men were dying, and continuing the fight would only increase the casualties without changing the outcome. It was the hardest decision a commander ever made. But Kruger was a realist before he was an ideologist. He ordered ceasefire. He ordered his surviving crew to prepare to abandon ship. And he reached for the signal flag stored in the conning tower, pulling out the white flag that every warship carried for this exact circumstance, the flag no commander ever wanted to use. He climbed out of the conning tower, fully exposed in the searchlight, and waved the white flag above his head. The firing from the submarine stopped immediately. The firing from the Boreas continued for a few seconds as individual sailors realized what was happening. Then silence fell across both vessels, broken only by the groaning of tortured metal as the ships ground against each other. Hutchins saw the surrender flag and ordered ceasefire. His crew obeyed reluctantly, fingers still on triggers, adrenaline still surging, but discipline held. The submarine crew began emerging from below deck, hands raised, climbing onto the submarine's deck where they stood in a group, perhaps 25 men, soaked, exhausted, defeated. The Boreas crew maintained their positions, weapons ready, waiting for orders. Hutchins considered his options. Standard procedure called for taking prisoners, but the situation was far from standard. His ship was locked against an enemy submarine that was sinking. If they remained entangled, the The submarine might take the Bori down with it as it sank. He needed to separate the vessels immediately. He ordered the engines reversed, trying to back away from the submarine. The Bori's propellers churned the water, but the vessels remained locked together. The submarine's bow wedged against the destroyer's hull. Hutchins ordered more power. The engine room pushed the diesels to maximum reverse, and finally the vessels began to separate, slowly, metal shrieking as they pulled apart. As the gap widened, the submarine crew jumped. Some dove into the water, others were thrown in as the submarine rolled with the wave action. Within 30 seconds, all the surviving crew members were in the water, swimming toward the Bori, or simply trying to stay afloat in the freezing Atlantic. The submarine, freed from the Bori, wallowed for a moment, water pouring through the holes in its hull. Then the bow tilted down and it began to sink. It went faster than Hutchins had anticipated, the bow plunging beneath the surface, the stern rising high, the propellers still visible in the searchlight beams. Then it slid beneath the waves and was gone, leaving only a spreading oil slick and debris field on the surface. The Bori's crew began the work of recovering survivors from the water. Lines were thrown over the side. Sailors climbed down cargo nets to help pull men from the water. The enemy sailors were hypothermic, exhausted, some wounded, but they were dragged aboard and immediately taken below deck to be warmed, dried, and given medical attention. Whatever they had been minutes before, they were now prisoners, and the laws of war and simple human decency demanded they be treated accordingly. Doris found himself at the rail, reaching down to grasp the hand of a submarine sailor who was struggling to climb the cargo net. The man's hands were so cold he could barely grip the ropes. Doris grabbed his wrist, braced himself, and hauled the man up onto the deck. The submarine sailor collapsed, gasping, water streaming from his clothes. He looked up at Doris, and for a moment, their eyes met. The German sailor was young, perhaps 18, with blonde hair plastered to his skull, skin pale with cold, eyes wide with shock. He said something in his language that Doris could not understand, but the meaning was clear enough. "Thank you." Doris nodded and moved to help another survivor. Over the next 20 minutes, the Bori's crew pulled 23 submarine sailors from the water. 2 more were recovered, but had already succumbed to the cold. The bodies were treated with respect, laid on the deck, covered with canvas. Later, they would be buried at sea with proper ceremony, because even enemies deserved that dignity. Below deck, the Bori's medical corpsmen worked frantically to treat the survivors: hypothermia, immersion injuries, wounds from the firefight. The destroyer's sickbay had exactly 4 bunks designed to handle routine illnesses and minor injuries, not mass casualties. The wounded were spread throughout available spaces, bunks in crew quarters, the mess deck, anywhere a man could lie down. Doris and the other mess attendants were ordered to assist with casualty care. They distributed blankets, brought hot coffee, helped remove wet clothing from men too cold to undress themselves. The submarine sailors accepted this help with evident confusion, because they had been told by their own propaganda that Americans, and especially black Americans, were barbaric, would certainly mistreat prisoners, might even execute them on the spot. Instead, they were being warmed, fed, and given medical care that was in some cases better than what they had received aboard their own vessel. One of the submarine sailors, a petty officer named Otto Sank, who spoke some English, tried to explain his confusion to Doris as Doris wrapped him in a blanket and handed him a cup of hot coffee. "We were told you would be cruel," Sank said, his teeth chattering. "We were told Americans had no honor, that black soldiers were especially dangerous, that we would be treated worse than animals." Doris looked at him for a long moment, thinking about his own experiences with casual cruelty, with being told he was inferior, with living in a nation that denied him basic rights while demanding that he risk his life in its service. He could have said many things. Instead, he simply replied, "We are not what they told you." And then he moved to help the next prisoner. Commander Hutchins inspected the damage to his ship. The collision had stove-in plates along the port bow. 3 frames were cracked. The forward ballast tank was flooded. The ship was taking on water at a rate of approximately 50 gallons per minute, not enough to sink them immediately, but enough to be concerning. His crew was working to shore up the damage, welding plates, installing patches, pumping water, but the Bori was going to need dockyard work before she could be considered fully operational again. He retired to his cabin and began writing his action report, the official document that would record the engagement for Navy records. Destroyer escort USS Bory, Gleaves class, engaged enemy submarine, Type 7C, at coordinates 48 degrees north, 27 degrees west. Depth charge attack resulted in forcing submarine to surface. Surface engagement followed. Collision resulted in hand-to-hand combat. Enemy vessel surrendered and subsequently sank. 23 prisoners recovered. 2 enemy dead. Bory sustained moderate damage, 2 casualties, crew performed admirably. He paused, thinking about what he had witnessed during the surface engagement. The mess attendants, fighting alongside white sailors, handling weapons with competence, showing courage under fire. Navy regulations said they should not have been there, should not have been armed, should not have participated in combat. But Navy regulations had not anticipated a close-range firefight on a destroyer's deck, had not imagined a situation where every available man would be needed regardless of his assigned duties or skin color. Hutchins added a paragraph to his report. Special commendation recommended for Mess Attendant First Class Doris Miller and Mess Attendants Marcus Washington, James Parker and Robert Johnson for actions above and beyond their assigned duties during surface engagement. These men performed combat duties with distinction, despite not being trained or assigned to weapons. Their courage and competence under fire was equal to any member of this crew. He filed the report, knowing it would generate questions, perhaps controversy, possibly resistance from officers who believed in maintaining strict segregation. But Hutchins had seen what he had seen, and he would not lie in an official document to preserve a policy he was beginning to question. The Bory limped back toward the convoy at reduced speed, and by morning had rejoined the other escort vessels. The convoy continued toward Britain without further incident. The submarine had been operating alone, not part of a wolf pack, and its destruction removed the immediate threat. The submarine prisoners were kept below deck, guarded but treated well. Navy regulations required prisoners to be given the same food as the crew, the same medical care, the same protection from the elements. The Bory's crew found this strange at first, sharing their limited resources with men who had been trying to sink them hours earlier. But orders were orders, and most sailors accepted it as just another odd aspect of naval service. Doris found himself assigned to help prepare meals for the prisoners, a duty that brought a certain irony given his original role. He worked in the galley, preparing the same stew and bread that the Bory's crew would eat, then carried trays down to the compartment where the prisoners were being held. The submarine sailors thanked him quietly in broken English, their eyes showing continued bewilderment at being treated with basic humanity rather than the cruelty their propaganda had promised. On the 3rd day after the engagement, Lieutenant Kruger asked to speak with Commander Hutchins. The meeting was arranged in Hutchins's cabin, with an ensign who spoke German acting as translator. Kruger stood at attention, still wearing borrowed American work clothes since his own uniform had been destroyed, and addressed Hutchins with formal military courtesy. "I wish to thank you for the treatment my men have received," Kruger said through the translator. "We expected to be treated as your propaganda suggests our forces would treat prisoners. Instead, you have shown honor and humanity. This will be remembered." Hutchins nodded. "We follow the laws of war," he replied simply. "Your men fought bravely. They deserve respect." Kruger hesitated, then continued. "I have a question, if I may ask it. During the surface engagement, I observed black sailors fighting alongside white sailors on your deck. They were armed, they were fighting, they seemed to be treated as equals in that moment. But aboard the submarine we were told that America practices racial segregation, that black citizens are considered inferior, that they would never be allowed to fight. How do you explain this contradiction?" Hutchins was quiet for a moment, considering his response. The truth was that he could not explain the contradiction because he was only beginning to recognize it himself. He had grown up accepting segregation as natural, had never questioned the Navy's policies, had simply assumed that tradition and regulation reflected some underlying truth about capability and merit. But watching Doris Miller and the other mess attendants perform under fire, showing the same courage and competence as any white sailor, had forced him to confront the possibility that tradition and regulation might be wrong. "America is not perfect," Hutchins finally said. "We have policies that are unjust, traditions that are outdated, but we are also a nation that can change, can recognize our mistakes, can become better. What you observed during that engagement may not reflect current policy, but I believe it reflects the future." Kruger nodded slowly. "Perhaps that is why you will ultimately prevail," he said, "because you have the capacity to learn from your contradictions. We do not. Our ideology demands perfect loyalty to doctrine even when experience proves doctrine wrong." The conversation ended, and Kruger was returned to the prisoner compartment. But his words stayed with Hutchins, adding to the questions that had been forming in his mind since the engagement. The Bory reached Scotland 6 days after the engagement, docking at a naval facility where the prisoners were transferred to a formal prisoner of war camp. The submarine sailors filed off the destroyer, some looking back at the ship and crew that had treated them with unexpected decency, perhaps wondering if the war they thought they understood was more complicated than their government had suggested. Doris watched them go from the deck, thinking about the strangeness of it all. Men who spoke different languages, who came from different nations, who had been designated as enemies by governments and politics, were fundamentally just men. They feared death. They valued their comrades. They wanted to survive and return home. The same as him. The same as every sailor aboard the Bory. The same as every soldier and sailor on both sides of every conflict throughout history. The Bory spent 3 weeks in the Scottish dockyard undergoing repairs. The damaged hull plates were replaced, the cracked frames were reinforced, the flooding was stopped. The crew was given liberty, time to explore the local town, drink in the pubs, walk streets that were not rolling beneath their feet. Doris and the other black sailors experienced Scotland's different racial attitudes with some surprise. The Scottish people had seen black soldiers and sailors from throughout the British Empire, and while prejudice certainly existed, it was not the systematic, institutionalized segregation they knew in America. They could enter the same pubs as white sailors, sit at the same tables, drink the same beer, and while they received some curious stares, they did not face the open hostility that would have met them in many American cities. While the Bory was being repaired, Commander Hutchins's action report was being reviewed by higher authorities. The report eventually reached the desk of Admiral Royal Ingersoll, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Atlantic Fleet, who read it with interest. The tactical details were commendable, a successful submarine destruction achieved through aggressive action and skillful seamanship. But the paragraph about the mess attendants troubled him, not because the men had performed poorly, but because their performance challenged policies that were considered essential to maintaining order and discipline in the Navy. Ingersoll ordered an investigation. A team of officers traveled to Scotland, interviewed Hutchins and his crew, examined the damage to the ship, reviewed the tactical decisions made during the engagement. The investigators were particularly interested in the actions of the mess attendants, interviewing them separately, asking detailed questions about what they had done, how they had acquired their weapons, whether they had been ordered to participate in combat or had taken the initiative themselves. Doris sat across a desk from a commander whose name he never learned, answering questions with simple honesty. "Yes, sir, I heard the order for every man who could handle a weapon to report to the deck. Yes, sir, I interpreted that to include mess attendants. No, sir, no one specifically ordered me to arm myself, but no one stopped me either. Yes, sir, I fired my weapon at enemy combatants during the surface engagement. Yes, sir. I believe my actions contributed to the enemy's decision to surrender. No, sir, I do not believe I violated any regulations, because the order was for every man, and I am a man." The investigating officers compiled their report and forwarded it to Admiral Ingersoll. The report concluded that the mess attendants had technically violated regulations by assuming combat roles, but that their actions had been taken in good faith response to orders issued during an emergency, that their performance had been exemplary, and that disciplining them would be unjust given the circumstances. The report recommended commendations rather than punishments, and further recommended that the Navy consider whether its policies regarding black sailors should be reviewed in light of their demonstrated capabilities. Ingersoll read the report, made his decision, and forwarded his recommendations to the Secretary of the Navy. The commendations were approved. Doris Miller, Marcus Washington, James Parker, and Robert Johnson were each awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for heroism. The citations praised their initiative, courage, and effectiveness in combat, noting that they had performed duties above and beyond their assigned roles. But more significantly, Ingersoll attached a memo to his recommendation, arguing that the Navy's policy of restricting black sailors to steward roles should be reconsidered. He cited the actions of the mess attendants aboard the Bory, the actions of Doris Miller at Pearl Harbor, and numerous other examples of black sailors performing effectively when given the opportunity. He argued that the policy represented an inefficient use of manpower, that it contradicted the democratic principles America claimed to be fighting for, and that it placed unnecessary limitations on the Navy's ability to utilize all available personnel. The memo was one of many similar documents being generated throughout the military in 1943, as the realities of global conflict forced military leaders to confront the contradictions between American ideals and American practices. The Army was experimenting with black combat units. The Navy was beginning to train black sailors for roles beyond steward. The Marine Corps, which had excluded black Americans entirely until 1942, was grudgingly beginning to accept black recruits. Progress was slow, resistance was fierce, but the war was creating pressure that would eventually transform American society. None of this was apparent to Doris as he returned to his duties aboard the Bory after the investigation concluded. He was presented with his medal in a ceremony on the ship's deck, the entire crew assembled, Commander Hutchins reading the citation, pinning the medal to Doris's uniform. Doris stood at attention, overwhelmed by the recognition but unsure what it meant for his future. He was still a mess attendant first class, still assigned to the galley, still part of a segregated military in a segregated nation. But something had changed, even if he could not quite articulate what. He had proven something to himself, to his shipmates, to the white officers who had written the reports and approved the medals. He had proven that courage and competence were not limited by skin color, that heroism did not require permission from those who believed themselves superior, that a man's worth was measured by his actions rather than the arbitrary circumstances of his birth. The Bory completed her repairs and returned to convoy escort duty. Doris returned to his potatoes, peeling them with the same practiced efficiency he had developed over thousands of hours. But now his shipmates treated him differently. They nodded when they passed him in the corridors. They included him in conversations. They acknowledged him as something more than just the cook. It was not equality, not yet, but it was progress. The war continued. The Bory escorted 12 more convoys across the North Atlantic, protecting merchant ships from submarine attack, battling storms, enduring the tedium and terror that characterized naval warfare. Doris served throughout, preparing meals, cleaning compartments, performing the duties assigned to him, but also knowing that if the situation demanded it, he could and would do more. In October 1943, the Bory encountered another submarine in the North Atlantic. The engagement followed a similar pattern to the first, depth charge attacks forcing the submarine to surface, a close-range gunfight and ultimately the submarine's destruction. This time Doris was explicitly ordered to take a position with a rifle, and he did so without hesitation, his actions now considered part of his expected duties rather than an exception to regulations. The Bory was not so fortunate in that engagement. A torpedo fired from the submarine struck the destroyer's engine room before the submarine was destroyed. The explosion caused catastrophic damage, and despite desperate efforts by the damage control parties, the Bory could not be saved. Commander Hutchins ordered abandon ship, and the crew took to life rafts in rough seas, waiting for rescue. 273 men entered the water. 268 were eventually rescued by other escort vessels. 5 were lost to hypothermia before rescue arrived. Doris was among the survivors, pulled from a life raft by sailors aboard the USS Barry, another destroyer. He was wrapped in blankets, given hot coffee, treated for mild hypothermia, and eventually transferred to a transport ship heading back to the United States. The Bory had been his home for 18 months. Now she lay at the bottom of the Atlantic, another casualty of the brutal war being fought across the world's oceans. Doris was reassigned to the escort carrier USS Liscombe Bay, reporting aboard in early November 1943. The Liscombe Bay was a Casablanca-class escort carrier, essentially a merchant ship hull with a flight deck added. designed to provide air cover for convoys that were beyond the range of land-based aircraft. She carried 28 aircraft and a crew of 916 men. On November 24, 1943, the Liscombe Bay was operating near the Gilbert Islands in the Pacific, supporting the invasion of Tarawa. At 0510 hours, a submarine torpedo struck the ship's stern, the explosion detonating the aircraft bomb magazine. The resulting blast tore the ship apart. The Liscombe Bay sank in less than 20 minutes. 644 men were lost, including Doris Miller, the hero of Pearl Harbor, the mess attendant who had proven his courage twice over, the young man from Louisiana who had never stopped believing that he deserved a chance to serve his country with honor. The loss of Doris Miller was announced to the public in December 1943. He became a symbol of both heroism and the tragic waste of segregation policies that had limited his opportunities to serve. His mother received his Navy Cross, his Navy and Marine Corps Medal, his Purple Heart, and a letter from the Secretary of the Navy expressing the nation's gratitude for his sacrifice. It was small compensation for the loss of a son, but it was all the nation could offer. But the story of the Bori engagement lived on, documented in official reports, discussed in training sessions, gradually becoming part of the broader conversation about race in the military. The action report written by Commander Hutchins was studied at the Naval War College, cited in policy discussions, used as evidence by officers arguing for desegregation. The memo written by Admiral Ingersoll joined dozens of similar documents, making their way through the bureaucracy, slowly building pressure for change. In 1944, the Navy began allowing black sailors to train for general service ratings beyond steward. In 1945, the first black officers were commissioned. In 1948, President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9981, mandating the integration of the armed forces. It would take years for the order to be fully implemented. Resistance would continue, but the policy of racial segregation in the military officially ended. The crew members who had served with Doris on the Bori never forgot him. In interviews conducted decades later for oral history projects, they spoke of his courage, his competence, his quiet dignity. Commander Hutchins, who survived the war and eventually retired as a rear admiral, testified before Congress in support of civil rights legislation in 1964, citing his experiences aboard the Bori as evidence that segregation was not only morally wrong, but operationally foolish. Marcus Washington, who survived the war and became a teacher in South Carolina, told the story of the Bori engagement to his students for 40 years, using it to illustrate how ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances could challenge injustice simply by doing their duty with courage and integrity. James Parker returned to Georgia and became a minister, preaching about the brotherhood of man and the dignity inherent in every person regardless of race. Robert Johnson moved to Chicago and worked in a factory, rarely speaking about his Navy service, but wearing his Navy and Marine Corps medal to church every Sunday. The submarine prisoners taken by the Bori also carried the memory of that engagement. Otto Schenck, the petty officer who had spoken with Doris, survived the war in a prisoner of war camp, returned to his home in Hamburg, and spent his remaining years working for reconciliation between former enemies. He wrote letters to American veterans organizations, sharing his perspective on the engagement, describing how the unexpected humanity shown by the Bori's crew had challenged everything he had been taught about his enemies. His letters were sometimes published in veterans magazines, contributing to the slow process of healing that followed the war. Lieutenant Hans Kruger, the submarine commander, also survived captivity and eventually became a teacher in West Germany, specializing in history. He lectured about his experiences, arguing that military discipline and national loyalty should never override individual moral responsibility, that soldiers must be willing to question unjust policies, even while following lawful orders. He made several trips to the United States, meeting with Navy veterans, visiting naval museums, participating in ceremonies that honored all who had served regardless of which side they had fought for. The actual submarine engagement that had brought these men together was documented in minute detail in the official records of both navies. The American Action Report provided the tactical details from one perspective. The surviving submarine log, recovered from Lieutenant Kruger's waterproof document case, provided the corresponding German perspective. Together, these documents allowed historians to reconstruct exactly what had happened during those intense hours in the North Atlantic. But the documents could not fully capture what the engagement had meant to the men who experienced it. The terror of being depth-charged in a submarine, feeling the shock waves slam against the pressure hull, knowing that the next explosion might crush you beneath hundreds of feet of water. The adrenaline surge of surface combat at close range, where you could see the men trying to achieve your destruction, where every second might be your last. The strange intimacy of hand-to-hand fighting between ships locked together, near enough to see expressions on your enemies' faces. The relief and guilt of survival when others did not survive. The complicated emotions of showing mercy to defeated enemies, while knowing that in different circumstances they would have shown no mercy to you. These experiences transformed the men involved in ways that statistics and tactical analyses could never capture. They had faced death and discovered that their own courage surprised them. They had encountered enemies and discovered their common humanity. They had challenged unjust policies simply by doing what circumstances demanded and discovered that individual actions could aggregate into social change. They had been ordinary men in an extraordinary situation, and they had proven that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when tested. The story of the Bori engagement became part of naval folklore, passed down through generations of sailors, sometimes embellished, sometimes simplified, but always emphasizing the core truth that courage knows no color and that recognition of that truth was long overdue. Young black sailors in integrated Navy crews decades later would hear about Doris Miller and the mess attendants of the Bori, would understand that they were serving in a navy that their predecessors had helped transform through their courage and sacrifice. The specific details of the engagement, the tactical decisions, the weapons employed, the damage sustained, all became teaching materials at naval schools. The engagement was notable not because it was the most dramatic submarine encounter of the conflict, nor because it involved the largest number of casualties, but because it illustrated principles that transcended the specific circumstances. Initiative matters more than rank. Courage emerges in unexpected places. Regulations must serve operational effectiveness, not ideology. The Navy learned these lessons slowly, painfully, but it did learn them. The physical evidence of the engagement gradually disappeared. The Bori's wreckage lies somewhere on the Atlantic floor, undiscovered, slowly being consumed by corrosion and marine life. The submarine's wreckage is nearby, equally lost to the depths. The men who fought that day are gone now, the last survivor passing away in the early 21st century. Even the official documents, the action reports and investigation records, exist now primarily as digitized copies, the original papers having deteriorated over decades in archives. But the story persists because it speaks to fundamental questions about human nature and social justice that remain relevant regardless of era. How do we recognize merit when our prejudices blind us to it? How do we challenge unjust policies while maintaining discipline and order? How do we reconcile our ideals with our practices? How do we learn from our mistakes without destroying the institutions that made those mistakes? These questions are not unique to the naval service of the 1940s. They are eternal questions that every generation must answer for itself. The 19-year-old black mess attendant who stood in the Bori's galley on that March morning in 1943, peeling potatoes and dreaming of doing something more meaningful with his life, could not have imagined how his actions would ripple forward through time. He was not trying to challenge segregation or transform society. He was simply trying to survive, to do his duty, to prove that he deserved respect. But his individual actions, combined with the actions of thousands of other black service members who faced similar challenges throughout the conflict, aggregated into a force that could not be ignored. The potato that became symbolic of the engagement, the humble vegetable that represented the mundane duties assigned to mess attendants, the unlikely weapon that, according to some embellished versions of the story, was actually thrown at enemy sailors during the hand-to-hand fighting, served as a metaphor for how ordinary things in extraordinary circumstances can become significant. The story was never really about potatoes any more than it was about submarines or destroyers. It was about human potential constrained by unjust policies, about courage emerging in unexpected places, about the power of individual actions to challenge systemic injustice. The naval service that emerged from the conflict was fundamentally different from the service that had entered it. Integrated crews, black officers, equal opportunity policies, none of these existed in December 1941. All of them existed by 1970. The transformation was not smooth or complete or without resistance, but it happened, driven partly by executive orders and legislation, but equally by the accumulated weight of thousands of examples proving that the old policies were wrong. Every black sailor who serves today in an integrated navy, commanding ships, flying aircraft, operating nuclear reactors, leading men and women of all races in defense of the nation, owes a debt to Doris Miller and the other pioneers who proved that excellence was not limited by skin color. They served in a navy that told them they were inferior, that restricted their opportunities, that expected them to accept discrimination as natural. They served anyway, and through their service they demonstrated the lie at the heart of segregation. The conflict itself ended in August 1945 with the unconditional surrender of all hostile forces. The cost had been staggering: 60 million dead worldwide, cities destroyed, economies shattered, societies transformed. The naval campaigns in the Atlantic and Pacific had involved hundreds of thousands of sailors, thousands of ships, and contributed decisively to the outcome. Submarine warfare had threatened to cut Britain off from supplies, but the convoy system and aggressive anti-submarine operations had prevailed. The industrial capacity of the United States, producing ships faster than they could be sunk, proved decisive. In the decades after the conflict, historians would analyze every aspect of the naval campaigns. They would study tactics, technology, logistics, leadership. They would identify key battles, decisive moments, crucial decisions. The engagement between the Bory and the submarine would rate perhaps 2 paragraphs in comprehensive histories of the Atlantic campaign, a minor action among hundreds, notable primarily for the unusual circumstances of the surface combat, rather than for strategic significance. But for the men who were there, who lived through those hours of terror and violence, who saw their assumptions challenged and their courage tested, the engagement was the defining experience of their lives. They measured time in terms of before and after that day. They judged other experiences against that standard. They understood, in ways that historians examining documents decades later could never understand, what it meant to face death and discover your own capacity for courage, to encounter enemies and discover their humanity, to challenge injustice simply by doing your duty. The story deserves to be remembered, not because it was the most important naval engagement of the conflict, but because it illustrates truths that transcend the specific circumstances. Courage is not the property of any single race or nation. Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice can be achieved through persistent pressure from those willing to challenge injustice. Institutions can change when their members demand change. Individual actions matter, even when those individuals hold the lowest ranks and the least power. Young people today who study the history of the conflict often focus on the dramatic battles, the famous commanders, the decisive moments that changed the course of the fighting. These are important and worth studying, but equally worth studying are the smaller moments, the individual experiences, the personal transformations that occurred in the midst of vast historical forces. The mess attendant who picked up a rifle and helped defend his ship. The submarine commander who chose surrender over needless death. The destroyer captain who wrote an honest report even though it challenged prevailing policies. The admiral who read that report and decided policy should change. Each played a small role in a larger transformation. The transformation continues. The fight for justice and equality that Doris Miller and his fellow black service members contributed to did not end with military desegregation. It continued through the civil rights movement, through decades of gradual progress punctuated by moments of dramatic change, through ongoing struggles to achieve the ideals that America has always professed but never fully practiced. Each generation inherits both the progress achieved and the work remaining. The lessons of the Bory engagement remain relevant because the questions it raises remain unanswered. How do we recognize merit when prejudice obscures it? How do we balance tradition against justice? How do we maintain discipline while encouraging initiative? How do we honor the past while acknowledging its failures? These are not questions with simple answers, but they are questions worth asking, worth wrestling with, worth teaching to new generations who will face their own versions of these eternal challenges. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.